The cold steel 1917 Frontier Bowie. Likely just named that to pair it to their 1917 naval cutlass that has a similar aesthetic in terms of all the bluing and the screwed-on grip scales. So it's not a copy of any particular historic example. Now, a lot of YouTubers have already done great reviews where they put this knife through bushcraft-style torture tests. So definitely check those out. I added this to my collection primarily for its martial capacity. And as for the why, here's one hint, and here's another. So is it Bowie or Bowie? If we go with the apparently Scottish roots of Jim's family name, it would be Bowie, from the Gaelic word that means fair-haired, and also satisfaction. Over 100 years later, and in the UK of all places, another soon-to-be legend chose the stage name David Bowie in order to associate himself with something notoriously American and dangerous. However, many of his UK fans began inexplicably pronouncing it Bowie, to the point that about 30 years later, an exasperated David admitted that he didn't know how to pronounce his own name anymore. Quick out-of-the-box sharpness. Does have a bit of a secondary bevel on it, but it's not too bad. Haven't touched it up at all. But, yeah. Not bad on paper. How about some triple wall cardboard? Not bad, but I do have one issue that we'll get to here in a second. Let's get specs and build quality out of the way, because there's something I need to deal with before we go much further than that. According to the website, 1085 high carbon steel, my test files put it somewhere between 55 and 60 HRC, so that's good. Blued blade is 12 1/4 inches long, and yes, I'm going to be looking down at my notes so I can give you the metric as well as the imperial, 31 centimeters. Now, you've got a bit of a ricasso finger choil here, and we'll talk about that in handling. But that reduces your usable edge by an inch to 11 1/4 or 28 centimeters. Blade width, front to back, 1.75 inches, 4.5 centimeters. Blade thickness at the spine, pretty impressive, 5 millimeters. Has good solid rigidity. Talk about weight here in a second. Steel, blued, S-curve guard, rosewood scales, attached apparently with 3 screws. We'll take it apart here in a second. 5 inches long, or 12.5 centimeters. Overall length, 17 5/8 inches, about 44.5 centimeters. Weight, 24 ounces, 680 grams. About an ounce lighter than that really chunky rifleman's knife. And we'll talk about that. In handling, speaking of handling, point of balance, 1.75 inches from the guard, about 4.5 centimeters. Everything solid. Is it full tang? Kind of, not really. You can see the tang through the front of the scales and partially at the butt, but you'll notice there's about a centimeter here where those scales wrap around the back. So I'm going to take it apart and we'll take a look at the tang and how it's put together. But the big thing I need to address, which you kind of got a hint of when I was trying to get through that heavy cardboard, these really square grips, a lot of other reviewers have pointed this out. I don't know whose hand these were built for, definitely not mine. So I just don't feel secure in handling this knife. I can't get a good grip on it. It actually feels kind of slippery, and for a knife this massive, that's not a good thing. So let's get it apart and take a look at what's underneath. During the intermission, let's talk about the sheath for a minute. I think it is designed to match their 1917 naval cutlass, but definitely reminds me of the sheath that came with the rifleman's knife, and I really do like that sheath. So you've got the blue theme on the metal parts throughout, nice heavy leather stitched on the back. Now this does have the button that allows you to remove the frog that includes a swiveling and very stout belt loop. So really impressed with the sheath, with one very small nitpick. I think this is one of their made in India products, so when it came to me, yeah, there was a lot of that white desiccant powder all up in there. I've been wiping it off the blade pretty much every time I pull it out of the sheath for the last several days, and yeah, there's just still a little bit on there, you can see. But other than that, sheath, awesome. Getting it apart was slightly more challenging than anticipated, but these jobs often are. One worrisome thing, the 3 screws, which are kind of sleeve screws here, the surprising amount of what looks like corrosion on them. But I'm happy to say no corrosion on the tang, and also awesome, the guard is spot welded on, so that's not going anywhere. The grips, one piece, and yeah, I had to struggle a bit because there was a touch of epoxy in there, not a whole lot, wasn't gunky, but yeah, it needed a little bit of, well, convincing to come apart. So what I'm going to do now is try to reshape these to fit my hands a little bit better and hopefully not wind up having to get entirely new scales to be continued. Well, hello there. Okay, I didn't want to take off a whole lot of wood, at least not on my first attempt, but I did want to do more than just round the corners. So inspired by some of my other knives of this size and Marshall function, tried to give it a little bit of taper. I didn't have much room to work with on the front strap because of the exposed tang. I didn't want to take off any steel, but I did manage to taper it a little bit on the sides towards the guard, and then on the back strap, again without taking off too much wood, tapered towards the guard and also rounded back a little bit towards the butt. Stripped off the original stain while I was at it, gave it a thin coat of Sedona red, just enough to bring out the grain, let it dry, thin coat of lacquer, and I would have to say, yes, I am really pleased with the result. Not just how it looks, but how it feels. Took it out, did a couple of quick pressure tests, the kind of things I do with my knives and swords. Some of the tests are to check the durability of the edge in the build, and some are to check how the weapon handles impact, transfers it back in the hand. Can I maintain edge alignment? So whacked this into my hard bamboo pel in a number of different Marshall maneuvers, and then chopped into some wood at different angles. Again, wasn't really concerned with how the edge would hold up because it did just fine. Wanted to see how it transferred impact back into this new grip. Was my grip secure? Could I maintain edge alignment? And the answer was yes, definitely. Feels great in hand now. So let's talk about how this handles as a Marshall knife. So why did I buy this knife? Well, if you've been following the channel, you know I'm a student of, shall we say, cross-cultural martial arts, looking for those universal similarities and unique differences across cultures and eras. Now, this knife is very similar in its build to one of my old favorites, the Ba Cham Dao. As a matter of fact, in this case, blade length and shape pretty similar, weight pretty similar. Now, this doesn't have the full D guard, but it does have a pretty sizable forward guard to protect the hand and, yes, potentially catch a blade. And while that back quillin is not nearly as hooked as a Ba Cham Dao, yeah, I think it would do a pretty good job in at least temporarily catching and trapping a blade. So, yeah, potential for cross-training. Am I going to get a second one so I have a pair? I don't know yet. But speaking of cross-cultural similarities, a while back I bought this cold steel rifleman's knife, which is a chunky beast, about the same size in terms of blade, but this one's about an ounce heavier, so I definitely feel more mass in the blade. Now I bought this specifically to be a left-handed weapon, a companion to a sword for parrying. Something solid enough to take a hit from a larger weapon, but not long enough that it might entangle with the primary, and I put it to a lot of use that way. And yes, I have made some modifications to it. I will probably do a follow-up video soon. Keep your eye out for it. But more recently, you may have seen my video on the cold steel take on the Argentine facon. And that opened a whole new path to me. Something I didn't realize existed before, and probably should have. Esgrima criolla, the martial art system of the Argentine gaucho. Now, you can certainly see similarities between that and North American Bowie knife, as well as, well, what arts like this descended from. In the case of Esgrima criolla, you're talking about Spanish destreza. So yeah, you're going to see similarities in the use of these weapons to what you might be familiar with already if you are a student of HEMA. And given the size of the blades, maybe also if you're a student of something like Filipino eskrima. So, yeah. Somewhere between a knife and a short sword, enough authority to cut, potentially parry, or if not block, at least do intercepting actions around an opponent's weapon. You can get some good chops, draw cuts, tip cuts, and yes, you can bring that back edge in. Now, this one doesn't have a sharpened back edge yet, but it certainly has a wicked hook on it. So you can do some of those backhand. You can also, it's got enough mass, you can use some of the flat strikes. And yes, even punch with the guard. So as a martial knife, especially since I've reprofiled this grip, it feels good. It's certainly a lot denser than my facon, but it feels a bit lighter than that rifleman's knife. Very, very similar to at least the Bat Cham Dao that fit me well. So yeah, in hand, that's a very familiar feel to me for just all sorts of different things. So yeah, it can be used very effectively in, well, a variety of different arts. So as a tool for that study, excellent. As a utility tool, refer to some of those other YouTubers who put it to that use. In the small experiments I've done with it, it's a sturdy knife. It's got a good edge. Now, quick note about this little choil up here, which is kind of in a weird place. It does actually function as a finger choil if you want to choke up on the knife. But because you have the back quillin, you can't really get your thumb back on the back of the blade to do any fine work very easily without that being in the way. But also I'm seeing potential for, if you happen to be a fencer who likes to finger his quillin, it's there. I would say most people would agree that's a hell of a risk for your index finger in encountering another live blade. But, yeah, there's something about that particular in-cut that could give you a little bit more control of something that you parried. So I think it's got some interesting use. So, yeah, I'm going to say awesome knife. I'll put the link to where I got it, Chicago Knife Works, down in the description below. If you have any questions about this, let's get our conversation going as usual in the comments. I'm also getting a lot out of what you're feeding me in terms of resources for learning more about knives and arts like this. So thank you, thank you, thank you for your input. Otherwise, as usual, thanks for watching, following my journey, subscribing to the channel, liking the videos, sharing the videos, adding to our conversation. And I do hope to see you back for, well, wherever my journey takes me next.